My presentation consists of promoting a critical perspective, a critical discussion, or a critical analysis of the influence of English, the lingua franca of the digital world. My intention is to promote some thinking, critical thinking, about some of the potential effects that the digital world, the digital technology has on the cognitive development, attitudes, identities, and worldviews of non-English dominant speakers who consistently navigate the internet. In particular, I think the greater risk is for the millennials and the Generation Z, but it is for all of us if we are uncritical consumers of the internet as well. My presentation has as its underlying theoretical perspective what is known as the linguistic relativity hypothesis, advanced by Sapir and Whorf. But it also has as a background or a backdrop the cultural relativity notion developed by Franz Boas, among others. To quote Boas, the behavior of any individual, all of us, is determined not by his or our racial affiliation, but by the character of our ancestry and our cultural environments. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, as promoted by Benjamin Whorf, in this quote, tells us that language shapes the way we think and determines what we can think about. Note that both are deterministic, and in either one of these two positions is the individual, or are we agents of our own selves. We are the object or the target of our respective social-cultural environments. In addition, Edward Sapir, who was Benjamin Whorf's professor, tells us that human beings do not live in the objective world alone, nor alone in the world of social activity as ordinarily understood. But we, as individuals, are very much at the mercy of the particular language which has become the medium of expression for their society. Again, he's not using the deterministic concept, but he does indicate that we are at the mercy of the particular language of our sociolinguistic environment. We are, again, the targets of, or the objects of, our community of speakers and our culture. Some of the salient factors that need to be understood of the strong form of these hypotheses is that there is no individuality, there is no will, other than the will to subject oneself to our culture and our environment. There is no agency, there is no self-determination, because like Sapir says, we are at the very mercy of the particular language of our language community and our cultures. The softer form, or the weakened form, of the relativity hypothesis, which is widely accepted, in some circles at least, tells us that language influences our thought and perception. Language influences our worldviews. This is more accepted because we know that language does indeed have a role in shaping our ways of thinking about reality, of interpreting the world, and interacting with others. Thus, the language we speak and think in shapes our perception of the world, not determines. It does not determine. And the speakers of different languages think and perceive reality in different ways. Therefore, each language has its own worldview. So, as you will see, there are 7,100 languages in the world today that are alive. Thus, if this is true, there would be 7,100 ways of interpreting reality, of perceiving reality, of thinking about reality. Now, there is some contemporary research that supports the linguistic relativity hypothesis. One prominent researcher in the field is Lera Boroditsky. She has a very interesting TED Talk, it's about 12-15 minutes, in which she demonstrates, or she discusses her research, in which she demonstrates that language indeed does contribute to shaping our way of thinking and our worldviews. It's worth visiting and listening to her. To quote her, what we have learned, what she has learned through her research, is that people who speak different languages do indeed think differently, and that even flukes of grammar can profoundly affect how we as individuals see the world or interpret reality. Language, therefore, is a uniquely human gift, central to our experience as human beings. It is incumbent upon us to understand and appreciate the role of language in constructing our mental lives and how it brings us one step closer to understanding the very nature of humanity. When discussing the state of the digital world and language, we're going to find some very interesting information. And this leads to the critical part of my presentation. The United Nations has an interesting concept about language as a primary vector for communicating information and knowledge. It considers that the opportunity to use one's language on the internet determines the extent to which one can participate in emerging knowledge societies. Unfortunately, sadly, the reality speaks otherwise. One can ask himself, or one can ask in general, how many languages are in the world today? To answer that question, Ethnologue in 2020 estimates that there are 7,117 languages spoken today. Of these, roughly 41%, or 2,926 languages, are now endangered because they have less than 1,000 speakers remaining. Some have even less than 10 speakers. Meanwhile, worldwide, only 23 languages of those 7,000 plus account for more than half the world's population. When we look at the internet, the digital world, and look into how many languages or which languages are most frequently used in the internet, we find that English dominates with 1.1 billion users as of April 2019. Following English is Chinese with less than 1 billion at about 863 million, and Spanish with 344 million. And you can see the rest of the languages. But I think it's interesting to note that languages who are highly esteemed worldwide, like French, German, perhaps Japanese, are far behind English on the internet. Languages Everything website documents that 55.5% of the internet content is in English. And if you'd add up all the other languages that are represented in the internet, all of them combined do not reach the percentage or the content of English in the internet. What we do know is that English has always dominated the web, even today, because as we just saw, 55.5% of all content on the internet is in English. However, only around 20% of the world's population speaks English at all. Moreover, only 5% of the world's population speaks English as a native language. What we conclude is that the internet is not inclusive of all languages and cultures. And for it to be an inclusive platform, we need to make the internet accessible to people across the world. and we have a long way to go in that respect. Wood, 2015. We can conclude, therefore, again, that the internet is not an inclusive platform, and that we need to do more work to make it more inclusive of other languages and culture so that they have representation and a voice on the platform, on the digital world. When looking at Wikipedia, for instance, as one of the worldwide platforms that is constantly resorted to, we find that Wikipedia has over 51 million articles in 308 languages alone, but 308 languages of the 7,100 languages alive today. That is almost 6,800 languages that are alive today have no presence online in Wikipedia. We also know, based on Wikipedia's reports, that American English or Western English dominates Wikipedia with over 6 million articles and almost 51 million pages. Not surprisingly, as of July 2020, Wikipedia documents the top 10 articles by language. We see that English again appears as a dominant language with over 6 million articles and over 51 million total pages, followed by Cebuano, which is a language spoken by Filipinos, and it has 5 million articles with 9.7 million pages total. In terms of the total number of pages in another language, French comes closest to English with 10.8 million pages, but is far behind English in number of total pages published in Wikipedia. When we take a look at Google, another platform that is recognized worldwide, we see that Google acknowledges 30 European languages. However, it only recognizes one African language and no indigenous American or Pacific languages. We can conclude, therefore, that 95% of all languages in use today will never gain traction online. As a result of the living 7,100 plus languages that are alive today, only about 355 will remain online. Sadly, we also know that predictions indicate that only around 300 will remain alive by the end of the century. That is, the internet will contribute to a non-globalized society, unless somebody does something about this. The Smithsonian Magazine in 2017 reported that 90% of the world's languages will die by the end of the century. There may be a slight conflict with the numbers between this source and Google and other sources. Concomitantly to language death, there is a loss of, according to Smithsonian Magazine, a unique vision of what it means to be human, because each language has its own definition of humanity, its own perspective of what it means and what it's like to be human. When a language dies, there is also the loss of memories of the world's history and cultures that are embodied and conveyed through the languages and cultures that die with the language. There's also the loss of best resources to combat environmental threats, and there's loss of mother tongues. Therefore, once again, rather than contributing to globalization and equal opportunity for all languages and cultures, the digital world's lingua franca, English, inasmuch as it dominates the internet, contributes to language and cultural death, because language is a repository of cultural knowledge. cultural history, of people. When a language dies, a part of humanity dies with it. When languages die, much of humanity dies with it or with them. Some of the conclusion that we can reach is that if American English is the world's digital lingua franca, it has the power to influence our cognition, perception, emotions, identities, culture, and behavior if we are uncritical and unaware of its power. Unfortunately, I would say that the digital world therefore becomes a strategic mechanism for global Americanization, an Americanization that is equal to unfettered and uncontested global assimilation to American culture. I would also say that inasmuch as American English is the predominant language of the digital world, it may be contributing to a worldwide manifest destiny, or a component of manifest destiny through language, in this case, English. Many languages are not present on the internet, as already indicated by the UN. There is a vast linguistic divide which exists in cyberspace today, and this will only exacerbate the digital divide. The UN and others consider that language as a primary vector for communicating information and knowledge, for exchanging information and knowledge among humanity, among its cultures. The opportunity to use one's language on the internet will determine the extent to which one can participate in the emerging knowledge societies. Again, this is not happening, unfortunately. There are some implications for international users of the digital world, and one of them, perhaps a primary, is to be proactive rather than reactive, accompanied by a critical use and perception of digital technology. In addition, we should also be critical users of the digital technology because it isn't neutral, as we just saw, and can lead to assimilation, especially of those who lose their native language, culture, and history, among which are the Generation Z and the millennials and the post-Google populations of the world that are up and coming. It's necessary to be aware of how unfettered digital assimilation is impartial, and we need to create an ethos receptive of the interdependence and influence of worldviews and languages as conveyed through the thousands of languages that are available and alive today. Lastly, as users, we would benefit if we recognize that our languages and any languages have the power to shape cognition and human behavior, and that they should avoid their absence in the digital world because it will only exacerbate the digital divide, and humanity will be at loss. Hopefully, we will all be critical of this as teachers, as educators, as administrators of language programs, as professors of teachers who work in the language education field, as parents. It will affect us all, and we need to be aware of all these things. We need to be conscious of how language can change the world. And rather than making it a global community, runs the risk of converting us into an assimilated community by the end of this century.